Thanks a lot for this invitation. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So just to give you a little bit of context, so I consider myself half an astrophysicist or planetary scientist and half climate scientist. And so you will feel across my presentation that the topic of today is really at the edge of these two particular scientific fields. Just to give you an overview of the presentation, so I will decompose this course in 5 different chapters or sections, as you prefer. And so in the first one, I will give you some definitions of habitability. So I will repeat some of the things you've already heard today and yesterday, but I consider it important because it will contextualize the definition that we use in the context of exoplanet, which is slightly different from what we are doing, for instance, in the solar system. Then I will talk about exoplanets at large and the concept of the habitable zone that you have all heard about. I will discuss then the habitability of exoplanets around low-mass stars. So why low-mass stars? It's because this kind of star actually, the stars where it is the easier to detect exoplanets that are similar to the Earth, but also the easier to characterize them, to characterize their atmosphere and probe the molecular, for instance, the molecular components of their atmosphere. Then I will show you some examples of current research on the topic of habitability of exoplanets with some results of 3D climate models, what we call GCM for global climate models. And last but not least, I will show you a quick overview of the observations that we expect to do of the atmospheres of potentially habitable exoplanets. And so this is super exciting because we have a lot of telescopes ongoing right now and in preparation right now that have in principle the capability to probe for the first time the atmospheres of small temperate exoplanets. So let's start first with what is habitability, and how do we define it and why? I do it very academically. So an habitable planet or a moon is a planet or a moon that meets all the necessary conditions, requirements for the emergence and development of life. And I should add a few words about that. This is life as we know it on Earth, because this is the only life really that we can define. So in practice, based on our experience on Earth, we know that life needs at least 3 to 4 components. The first one is carbon, so you already heard that a lot, because carbon is needed to make complex chemistry. We also need some nutrients that we call the schnops, not the schnock, and liquid water. So liquid water as a solvent. Liquid water has some super interesting properties. It can form hydrogen bonds. It is stable for a wide range of pressure temperature that makes it a really unique solvent for life to emerge and develop. And there are super interesting courses. If you go on the YouTube channel of the RED conference, you can watch dedicated courses, especially on the properties of liquid water. So I really encourage you to have a look at them. Then you need a source of energy. So on Earth, there are essentially 2 types, either energy from the photons or either energy from the ground. What is important to note is that on Earth, and I believe on most planets and exoplanets, usually it is expected that the solar radiation, so the number of photons in terms of energy, will be always much higher, or almost always much higher than the amount of energy that is taken from the ground, from the interior. So for instance, you have here 2 maps that shows you the annual average here absorbed solar radiation flux on the right and geothermal heat flux on the left. And you see that here this is milliwatt per square meter, and here this is watt per square meter. And there are almost 3 to 4 orders of magnitude difference between the two. So way more energy in the photons. Last but not least, so this is probably the most, controversial part. I believe, at least on our experience on Earth, that a surface is needed. So it has been speculated that life could potentially emerge and develop in the clouds, in the liquid water clouds, for instance, of Jupiter and more recently of Venus. So this is super controversial. I will not go into that pathway. So today I will focus only on planets that do have a surface. Leads me to refine a little bit this definition of a habitable planet or moon is a planet or moon that has a surface, some liquid water, some carbon and the nutrients, H, N, O, P, and S, and last but not least, a source of energy. And this is actually the typical definition that is adopted by scientists working on the solar system, for instance, in the context of Mars, for instance. There is one of the ingredients that is particularly interesting because we believe in most cases that this is the most limiting factor for the habitability of planet, and this is the availability of liquid water. So if you look in the solar system, there is one, at least, planet that do have liquid water. This is the Earth. But in fact, there are lots of objects that do also have liquid water, but not at their surface, but in the underground. This is the case of the satellites of the giant planets in the solar system. It is also the case of some dwarf planets. For instance, you may recognize here Titan, Pluto, Europa, Enceladus, and the exact location of this liquid water in the subsurface varies depending on the size of the object, the surface temperature of the object, the internal heat flux. But you see that we do expect that a lot of these objects do have liquid water in the interior. But there is a clear distinction that we need to make, at least in the context of exoplanet, between having liquid water in the underground or at the surface. The reason is that deep subsurface environments, so subsurface liquid water ocean, are very difficult to explore in situ and are almost impossible to explore remotely. This is the first point that I want to make. Moreover, if, let's say, liquid water is present at the surface and some life form, develop in it, then life can benefit from the energy that is brought by the solar photons and can use it to easily modify the atmosphere in a detectable way. And so there is really a point that in the context of exoplanet, we essentially focus on planets when we talk about habitability that do have liquid water on the surface and not in the subsurface, just because of observational reason. We do expect, in the solar system, we have a lot of objects that do have liquid water in the underground. So it is expected that maybe around other stars, it will be likely that this object could be common. But we do not have easy way at least, to probe this object with all the techniques that I will present you over the course of this presentation. And so this is the reason why in the exoplanet community, the community of exoplanet scientists, we usually define the habitability of a planet or a moon as a planet that do have surface liquid water. And this will be the common points of all the rest of this presentation. Now that I have, defined the range of parameters regarding habitability, I will now go to the second chapter of this presentation, where I will give you a quick overview of exoplanets and the definition of the habitable zone. So this plot is maybe what we call in the exoplanet community the boring plot. So this is the plot whenever you go to watch an exoplanet conference, and all the people in the room that have already been to an exoplanet conference have already seen this slide a number of times. So sometimes it's updated. In this case, it's updated. I did my job. So 2023. And you see it represents the cumulated number of exoplanets detected over the course of the years. With the different colors corresponding to the different techniques. So some of the techniques were discussed and summarized in the talk this morning. You see that essentially two techniques are really favorable to detect exoplanets, radial velocity and transit. This is the two techniques discussed this morning. And you see that since the first detection of an exoplanet in 1995 by two Swiss astronomers that got the Nobel Prize from it, the number of detected exoplanets, or cumulated number of detected exoplanets, has increased almost exponentially. You derive the conclusion that you want. And today, as of the beginning of 2023, you see that we have reached almost 5,000 detection of exoplanets, which is a lot. This success is I think strongly linked to a space mission that is named Kepler, and that died, but that operated for almost 10 years, and that looked at a region of the sky with a lot of stars, actually hundreds of thousands of stars, and monitored over the course of the lifetime of the mission the luminosity of the stars to look for transit events. So transit events, I will repeat what you've heard this morning, but this will be important for the rest of my presentation. Basically, if you look at a star and you have the chance that this star has a planet and that it is oriented exactly so that when it passes here it passes exactly in front of the star, then you will see a drop in the luminosity. And this drop is a function of the radius of the star and the radius of the planet. So if you know the radius of the star, you can derive the radius of the planet. And if you measure this drop, at a given frequency, you can derive the orbital period of the planet. So you have kind of a measurement at the same time of the size of the planet and as well of the insolation or the equilibrium temperature of the planet. And so Ethan Kruse did a very nice animation a few years ago about most of the systems that were detected, most of the planetary systems that were detected by the Kepler mission. And what you see here are all the systems, so you will see a de-zoom of all the diversity of planetary systems that have been explored, where basically they are to scale within each other, but of course they are much more distant from each other than what is shown in this picture. It's just that it will not just fit in all the picture. And you see that the colors, they represent the typical equilibrium temperature that we derive from the orbital period and from the insolation. So you see a lot of variety of exoplanets, which is super interesting. There is much more variety than we do have in the solar system, in fact. And so some people have used these observations, in particular, so this result, it was also confirmed, by ground-based measurements with the radial velocity technique. So this is really robust. And so people have used this data, this transit, to do some statistics and to reach the conclusion that were already presented this morning. But the first one is that planets are abundant. Rocky planets, I mean by rocky planets that are small enough to have a rocky composition on average. They are also abundant. And last but not least, rocky planets orbiting in temperate orbit around their star, which is typically the insolation on Earth, Mars, Venus, typically. We also know that they are abundant, which means a significant fraction of stars, in particular the low mass stars, I will come back to this a bit later, are believed to host planets that are at least, at first order, good candidates for being habitable planets. So we do have a concept to quantify what is a potentially habitable planet. This is something known as the habitable zone, and this is a concept that is sometimes controversial, and I believe that the origin of the controversy around this naming, or this term, is actually the naming and the fact that this is a bit weird to call this habitable zone. We call an apartment habitable, a flat, you rent a flat, it's habitable. But the habitable zone, it only means in the context of exoplanet having liquid water on the surface. So it might be a bit disconnected from what the general public, at least, understand of this concept. So really, for the rest of my presentation, whenever I discuss about the habitable zone, this is really the capability of a planet to have liquid water on the surface, nothing else. So you can imagine very roughly that, so this is really unwavering at the moment, that there is a zone around a star where if you are too close from the star, well, your water will evaporate. So no more water on the surface, no more liquid water on the surface. And if you are too far away from the star, well, it's too cold, so the water freezes, and so you have no more liquid water at the surface. At first order, then you do expect that this habitable zone strongly depends on the type of star, because if you are around a star, a massive star, bright star that is very luminous, then this zone will be far away from the star. And if you go to a very cool star, a low mass star, then the star will be much less luminous. And so you do expect this zone to be much closer from the star. And so at first order, this is really the luminosity of the star that controls roughly the location of this habitable zone. But in fact, there are really a lot of parameters to consider and that may influence the habitability and more specifically the capability of a planet to have a surface liquid water. So the first one is irradiation, the flux. So this is exactly what I just said. This is controlled by the luminosity of a planet and the distance to the star. But this also depends on the spectrum. So this is the spectral energy distribution, the SED, the composition and thickness of the atmosphere. If you have a lot of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it will be much warmer than if you have a thin atmosphere. And then there are also parameters like the rotation rate of the planet, the amount of what we call volatile, so water, for instance, species that could condense at the surface. You see that, for instance, on Earth, the surface is almost completely covered by ocean, but on Mars, most water are located at the poles, so very different water content and very different surface coverage of water. It also matters a lot to consider the size and the gravity of the planet, and then we can also go to subtle things like eccentricity, obliquity, topography, etc., etc. So there are lots of parameters to consider. So the way people have, let's say, found to really tackle this problem at the same time is to develop sophisticated tool that we call climate models, and that try to ingest all of these parameters at the same time to study their combined effect. And so I will show you an animation of what I would consider one of the state-of-the-art global climate model simulation. So this is really what you are doing here. You are trying to simulate all the processes, all that happens in an atmosphere. So this is here in the case of the Earth, but we are trying to do the same for planets and exoplanets. So what you see here is that we are following, so each color follows what we call a tracer in the atmosphere, which is here particles that are lifted in the atmosphere. For instance, this is in green organic matter. Here, this is lifted sand. And in white, this is salt that is lifted into the atmosphere. And so you see that these particles, they essentially traces the winds and the circulation into the atmosphere. And so that really was possible, this kind of simulation, by combining all the processes that happens in an atmosphere all at once. That includes solving the hydrodynamical equation, also known as the Navier-Stokes equations, some thermodynamics to simulate the formation of clouds, the evaporation of water, the precipitation, snowfall, etc. The radiative transfer, because this atmosphere, these particles and this cloud, this surface, it will interact with light, so it will absorb some light, emit some light, scatter some light, and all of these ingredients put together, they can be used to simulate, the climate of the Earth, but also to explore the habitability of planet. So this is kind of, let's say, the most sophisticated version of the climate model that we are looking at. But in practice, there is a large hierarchy of numerical climate models. So this is what I've just been talking about, 3D global climate model. But you can go to a less and less sophisticated model until reaching one-dimensional inverse radiative convective model that I will discuss in the coming slides. Essentially, these models are much more complex and accurate because they implement a lot more physics and even sometimes chemistry. So just to give you a little bit of a kind of metaphor, because we are at the red, this is what I will consider the stork of the climate model hierarchy. This will be the buzzard and this will be the Parisian pigeon. So of course it's not very sophisticated, not very complex, but it does have the advantage of being super efficient and flexible. And so basically this full hierarchy of model, can be used to tackle the habitability of planet, and in particular, this model, I'm making fun of them, but they have been really essential to put, let's say, the first stones in the definition of the habitable zone. This is a model that we have been developing like a few years ago, and it uses really the climate model we are developing in my lab. But this is designed as an online interactive version just to show you the kind of what I mean by this model being flexible. So I will launch the simulation. Hopefully it's gonna work. Yes, it's working. It's impressive. Internet connection is really good. And so what you see here is really like there is a cluster in Paris just running at the moment, a climate model in it. And so what you see here is the evolution over the time of several quantities, outputs that can be provided by the model. So this is surface temperature. This is a 1D model, so we are modeling here the water vapor profile into the atmosphere. This is the temperature profile. This is the orbit of the planet, and this is the energy budget. This means at the top of the atmosphere, we count how much energy is coming, how much energy is reflected, and how much energy is emitted by the planet. And I will show you some examples. For instance, let's increase the eccentricity of this planet. Well, by doing that, you will see that it will change the orbit, and of course, it will change the energy budget over the course of the time. So it will oscillate depending on how close the planet is from the star, and it will directly impact the surface temperature on the planet and the water vapor profile and temperature. Now that we have done that, we can say, okay, let's add lots of CO2 into the atmosphere. So let's put 100% CO2. Then if you do that, of course, you decreases a lot the emission by the planet, so that produces some greenhouse effect. And so the surface temperature is going to rise to very high values. Then let's put it around TRAPPIST-1. So TRAPPIST-1 is a very cool star. So again, because we are around a very cool star, it will change the way let's say the SED, the spectral energy distribution, is at the top of the atmosphere. So it will change a lot the energy budget, which will change the surface temperature again and again. I don't know, someone wants to try some crazy ideas or? So let's completely remove the flux, for instance, received by the planet. And then you will see that the surface temperature will decrease until at some point it reaches like a snowball state. And so this tool is just to show you a little bit of, okay, this model, you know, they include much less physics. It's here in this case, it's essentially convection and radiative transfer, but they are very useful because they are super flexible and we can use them to explore a wide range of parameters. And this is essentially what people have been using historically in the reference paper to define what we call the habitable zone. And so this is summarized in this plot that essentially shows you on the x-axis the insolation that is received on the planet, and the y-axis the temperature of the star around which the planet is. What you see is that this zone here defines where a planet can potentially have surface liquid water. And so this is essentially controlled by two atmospheric processes. The first one is the runaway greenhouse, and the second one is the maximum greenhouse. And I would like to go a bit through these two processes because they involve interesting thought experiments. So let's look at the first one, runaway greenhouse. This is really a transition here that tells you that if you put a planet like Earth right here, then you will expect all the water from the ocean to suddenly evaporate into the atmosphere. So for that, to illustrate a little bit how we reach this conclusion, I will show you an example that was derived here from the reference paper in the literature. So really, if you need to learn something about the habitable zone, this is where you should start. Casting 1993 and Koparapu 2013. So really, this is the first paper to look at. And so what you see here is the surface temperature as a function of insolation. And so we'll make a thought experiment where we'll take the Earth, in this simulation simulated with a 1D climate model, and we'll change the insolation. So of course, if you start at low insolation, you have a low surface temperature because you have little greenhouse effect. The atmosphere is playing little greenhouse effect. But if you increase the insolation, then you will increase the energy budget, so you will increase the surface temperature. So roughly, just to give you some context, this is where the Earth would lie, at 1 times the Earth insolation. So roughly, surface temperature of 288 Kelvin. What happens is that there is a threshold that what we call the runaway greenhouse threshold, at which if you suddenly increase the insolation by a little bit, then what's happened is that you go into a positive feedback loop, a runaway greenhouse, that suddenly leads you from this temperature, a few hundred Kelvin, to suddenly a few thousand Kelvins, just by changing a little bit the insolation. And this is related to a very robust atmospheric process that we call the runaway greenhouse effect, and that is due to the greenhouse effect of water vapor. The idea is that there is a certain threshold that if you reach, then by increasing the surface temperature, you will increase the evaporation of the water from the surface. But this water vapor that goes into the atmosphere, it will produce some greenhouse effect. And if this greenhouse effect is stronger and stronger, it will, of course, increase the surface temperature. And you go in a loop like that we call a positive feedback. And the only way to escape it is to emit so much, to have a surface that is so hot that it starts to emit in the visible wavelength where the atmosphere is transparent. And this only happens when you reach typically thousands of Kelvin into the atmosphere. And so this defines a really sharp transition that you cannot really escape as a planet. And that defines the inner edge of the habitable zone. Let's look at the overhang. The overhang is called the maximum greenhouse. So if you think about it, like how would you imagine a planet to keep it habitable as far as possible from the star? what you will do is you put as much greenhouse as possible, right? So this is exactly the experiment I'm going to present you. In this case, we are looking at the insolation as a function of the greenhouse gas content into the atmosphere. So the idea here is that you will, again, it's a result of a 1D climate model. And so what you will see here is what is the minimum insolation for a given atmospheric content. So here we are looking at CO2. What is the minimum insolation at which you can still keep liquid water at the surface? So if you change and you increases the CO2 atmospheric pressure, then you will expect to have more and more greenhouse effect, right? So if you have more and more greenhouse effect, then your surface temperature is going to be higher and higher. Or if you think the other way around, the insolation that is required to maintain surface liquid water will be lower and lower. And this is exactly what we see in these simulations. So you increase the CO2 content, and so you decrease the insolation at which essentially you can have an habitable planet, or you increase the distance at which you can put a planet away from a star. But in fact, what happens is that in this simulation, we also see that there is, in fact, a maximum threshold, because at some point, if you put too much CO2 into the atmosphere, what happens is that there are other processes, in particular Rayleigh scattering, but also CO2 condensation. So essentially, Rayleigh scattering is scattering by molecules in the atmosphere. So you have photons from the star that hit the atmosphere and that get scattered away by the molecules, the CO2 molecule into the atmosphere. So essentially what it does is that it increases the albedo of the planet. And then at some point, if you put too much into the atmosphere, you reach the point where at the surface, if you add one more molecule of CO2, it will start to condense. And if it condenses at the surface, then you cannot accumulate CO2 anymore in the atmosphere. And so there is a maximum amount of CO2 here that is roughly around 7-8 bar for the case of a planet around the sun. That defines what we call the maximum greenhouse, and this is the maximum, let's say, amount of CO2 you can put to keep a planet habitable. And this is really what defines the outer edge of the habitable zone. And so if you think about it the way I presented it, essentially what the habitable zone tells you is that this is the zone where it is not impossible to have surface liquid water. It doesn't mean that if you have a planet inside this zone, it will be habitable, but it means that if you are outside of this zone, then in principle, it's impossible to be habitable in the astrophysical sense. That is to say, having surface liquid water. Of course, if you go in that direction, there is the possibility to have liquid water underneath, but then, again, this is something we cannot really probe with observations, so we don't really talk about it. What I would like to say, there is something more, is that actually I believe that, and most people believe that, the habitable zone is a bit more than just the zone where it is not impossible to have surface liquid water. And for that, I need to speak a little bit of a geophysical cycle that is called the carbonate silicate cycle, that we believe is a key process to control the habitability of the Earth on the long term, and that is really one of the pillars of the definition of the habitable zone. The idea is that on the Earth, so if you have a planet like the Earth with some liquid water on the surface, some oceans, some seas, and some CO2 as well into the atmosphere, then whenever it rains on this planet, then rain will dissolve CO2. Okay? This acidic rain will dissolve some exposed silicate rocks, which will produce dissolved ions. And then you will have rivers transporting these ions into the oceans, where they will form carbonates that will precipitate at the bottom of the ocean. And on Earth, because we have plate tectonics, it will get subducted, so back to the interior, where at high temperature it will be converted back in CO2. And so like that, you have a full cycle of CO2 from the atmosphere to the interior, back to the atmosphere. One of the key aspects of this geochemical cycle on Earth is that the weathering process is strongly temperature dependent. At high temperature, it's super efficient, and at low temperature, it's not very efficient. As a consequence, this carbonate silicate cycle is actually very efficient to stabilize the climate of a planet. If the temperature of your planet increases, whatever the reason, then you will increase the weathering rate, which will decrease the atmospheric content, because the volcanic outgassing, it will remain the same. which will decrease the greenhouse effect. And so that stabilizes, which means if your temperature increases, the greenhouse effect decreases. So this is a stabilizing effect. Again, if your planet has a temperature, surface temperature that decreases, then the weathering rate is expected to decrease, which will, well, weathering rate decreases, so volcanic rate, which is the same, put more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. And so that produces more and more greenhouse effect. And so that increases the temperature. And so this is, again, a negative feedback. And so you see that, essentially, we believe, at least on Earth and potentially on other planets, that this CO2 cycle, the carbonate silicate cycle, could be a mean with CO2 to stabilize planet, the atmosphere of planet, the climate of planet, and therefore their habitability, as soon as they are inside of the habitable zone. And so the habitable zone is a little bit more, as I said, than the zone where it is not impossible to have surface liquid water, but it might also be the zone where surface liquid water get naturally stabilized by the existence of this carbonate silicate cycle. I just would like, so I didn't say it before, but in each of the sections I will discuss, I just would like to give you one open question that I believe is important. And there is one mystery, I believe, around this specific definition of the habitable zone, and that connect very strongly to the solar system and to the previous presentation. If you look carefully today, you see that Mars is in the habitable zone. But it's not habitable, at least in the definition that I said. But we just heard in the previous lecture that, let's say, billion years ago, typically 3-4 billion years ago, we have some evidence that there were lakes and potentially, so this is more controversial, but potentially even liquid water oceans at the surface. Except that at the time, 3-4 billion years ago, the sun was less luminous. And so if you put Mars, but 3-4 billion years ago on this diagram, it sits right here. So in other words, the only planet except the Earth in the solar system where we can test this concept, because we have observations of, early Mars was habitable, at least in the definition I'm using. And this only planet is outside of the habitable zone. And we don't know why. And frankly, it's a really, really, I believe, important enigma, and no one really has a good explanation for why. The only example except the Earth that we do have of an habitable planet, which is early Mars, doesn't fit essentially the concept that we have built and that we are using in the context of exoplanets. So I don't know, maybe someone in the room has or will have some ideas. But please, this is a very interesting topic, so don't hesitate. Okay, let's move to the chapter 3 of this presentation. So now I'm going to focus on some specific exoplanets, which are exoplanets orbiting around the lowest mass star in the galaxy. And the reason why I'm focusing specifically on this type of exoplanet, it's not because they are more interesting than other, let's say, planets around other systems. It's just because this is where we'll have observation, first detection and then observation of their atmosphere first. And so this is the first exoplanets where we can actually, outside of the solar system, test our concept of habitability and potentially search, real, potentially habitable planets. So just to give you some context, so this is an artist's view of the sun versus a typical red star. So the red star, so they have some different synonyms. So we call them low mass stars, we call them cool stars, we call them red star, we call them M star. And basically, it's essentially synonyms. It's just the fact that the lowest mass star in the galaxy are cooler. And because they are cooler, their black body spectrum is shifted to higher wavelengths. So the stars essentially look redder than the sun. And they are also they have also a radius that is much lower and a luminosity that is much lower. The thing is that all the observational techniques that we do have a strong, let's say, observational bias for the detectability and the characterization of planets around these low mass stars. If you think, I will just take the example of the transit, but it is the case for a lot of different techniques. But if you think about the transit technique, okay, essentially we are looking at a planet passing in front of a star. So there are two ways to increase the signal-to-noise ratio of such observation. The first one is to increase the size of the planet, because if the planet is bigger, while essentially it will leave a bigger drop, okay, in the signal, so it's easier to detect. And the second way to do it is decreasing the size of the star, because if you decrease the size of the star, well, the depth of this signal, the depth of this transit, will be much deeper. And so in practice, it will be much easier to actually detect an Earth-like planet around a low-mass star, a cool star, rather than around a Sun-like star. This is only one of the, let's say, reasons, but there are also other reasons. For instance, I told you that these cool stars, they are less luminous, which means the habitable zone around these stars is much closer from the star, which means planets that are in the habitable zone of this star, because they are closer, they have an orbital period that is much shorter. And so transit events are much more frequent. So it's much easier, to accumulate some signals and to detect something around these planets. And there are lots of other different biases, but I will not go through all of them. But essentially, what you have to remember is really there is a strong observational bias toward these planets around low-mass stars. And so this is why a large fraction of the community of people working on exoplanets are currently focusing observation program on these specific targets. There is another bias which I find super interesting, is that the low-mass stars are actually the most frequent star in the galaxy, which means that luckily, if we look at so it's not luckily because they are the more frequent, but if you look at the solar neighborhood, so this is an animation that shows you all the known stars within 30 light years. Essentially, you see that the color characterizes the type of the star, and all the red color that you see here are pointing to red stars, and so cool stars. And so you see that most of the points here, most of the dots, they are red, which means in the neighborhood, most of the solar system, most of the planetary system are actually planets orbiting around low-mass stars, which is really great news because we have a lot of them, and so the probability to detect good targets is much higher if we have lots of planets in the neighborhood. And so essentially, this technique to focus observation program on low mass stars has been very, 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 let's say, good in terms of science return. So what you see here is a diagram that shows you the insolation that is received on a planet as a function of a distance from us. And so the free line that you see here corresponds to the insolation on Mars, insolation on Earth, and insolation on Venus. So 1995 is the year of the discovery of the first exoplanet. So at the time, the first exoplanet to be detected was a giant planet, super hot, so it doesn't fit in this diagram because it will be here, right here. And of course, it doesn't have a mass and a radius to be considered a rocky exoplanet. We had to wait for 2011 actually to get the first detection of a planet that I will consider in the temperate zone in general. So this is HD 85512b, detected by some colleagues at the Geneva Observatory, again Geneva Observatory. And in 2019, this is where we are. Lots of planets were detected with different techniques, the radial velocity, here in blue, and the transit method in red. The two techniques are favorable against planets orbiting red stars, and almost all, not all, but almost all these planets that you see here are actually exoplanets that are detected around low mass stars. It's essentially because we do have observational bias. So there are some of them that are super famous. The first one is Proxima b. So you see it here. This is the closest exoplanet from us. So in this diagram, it essentially is right at the bottom, a few light years away from us. And this is an artist view of the planet. And then we do have the TRAPPIST-1 system that you see here. And this is the closest planetary system of transiting temperate rocky exoplanet. And this is very important because that makes the systems the best that we do have for follow-up observations. And this will probably, we know it almost for sure now, this will probably be forever, at least in our lifetime, the best planetary system of small temperate planet that we'll have to look for atmospheres and test our concept of. And this is another artist view here of the 7 planets of the TRAPPIST-1 system, which is really exceptional. It's really 7 planets with the masses, the radii, and the insolation that are really close to the solar system terrestrial planets. So it's a really unique natural laboratory to test our concept of habitability. there are a few things you need to know. It's that, okay, we look at them, these systems, because they are much easier to detect, much easier to characterize, but they have some specialties, let's say some particularities that are quite different for at least when we compare them with solar system terrestrial planets, and that we need to keep in mind if we study the habitability of this planet. The first one is that these planets, they are so close from their host star that we expect the tides, the gravitational tides that are exerted essentially by the star on the planet, to let the planet evolve into a rotational, let's say, configuration that is called synchronous rotation, where essentially the planet is always showing the same side to the star with a permanent day side and a permanent night side. It's essentially the same thing that we do have between the couple of the moon and the Earth. The moon is always showing the same face to the Earth. This is the same process. The second, let's say, particularity is the fact that the luminosity of low mass stars evolves very differently from that of solar type stars. What you see here is the evolution of the luminosity of the TRAPPIST-1 star as a function of time. What you see here is that before reaching, let's say, a value that is roughly constant, it essentially decreased over a period of 1 gigayear by almost 2 orders of magnitude in terms of luminosity. This is what we call the pre-main sequence phase, and it corresponds roughly to the phase in the evolution of a star where the star is trying to get rid essentially of the energy that it had when it formed, essentially from the accretion. And this is very important because this means that if the planets were already there, and this is likely the case around the star, it means that the insolation they received in the first, let's say, tens to hundreds of million years of their lifetime was much higher than what they receive today. So let's say if you look at a planet around the TRAPPIST-1 star, and that today it lies inside the habitable zone, then if you go back in time, let's say hundreds of millions of years, at the beginning of the evolution of the star, then the insolation was much higher on the planet. And of course, at this time, because the insolation was much higher, then the planets that are in the habitable zone today were not in the habitable zone in the past. Last but not least, this is also another very important, let's say, particularity to introduce. This is the fact that stars that are low mass stars are supposed to be much more active than stars like the sun. And this is well illustrated in this plot that shows you the irradiation spectrum. So this is essentially the spectral energy distribution, the SED, as a function of the wavelength. In blue, this is typically the spectrum that is at the top of the atmosphere of the Earth. And in red, this is the same, like if you were replacing the sun by TRAPPIST-1. So you see a few things. First of all, you see that the black body spectrum, so this is what you see here, is shifted to higher wavelength for a redder star. This is expected because they are cooler. So the peak of the black body is shifted to the right. But you see that in this part of the spectrum, you see that the non-thermal emission of the star here is much higher than for the sun. And essentially, these photons that you see here below 100 nanometer in the UV up to the X, essentially the extreme UV up to the X, they are in average much higher around low mass stars than around sun-like star. And this is exactly the photons, that will, when they will reach the atmosphere, that will break the molecules and that will essentially produce atmospheric escape. And so we expect that planets that are orbiting low mass stars are subject to a much stronger atmospheric erosion because of this difference in terms of SED between low mass stars and solar type stars. And so if you put this observation, let's say, together, it means like if you take a planet like the Earth and you put it around a star like TRAPPIST-1, for instance, and you let it evolve through time, so this is here the location of the inner edge of the habitable zone, essentially what will happen is that when you combine this phase of runaway greenhouse and this phase of intense atmospheric erosion, it means like very likely a planet like the Earth will completely lose its atmosphere around that type of stars. Yet, because we don't know, let's say, the amount of volatile and the thickness of the atmosphere that the planet possesses, and how much volatile can be degassed from the interior, there is still the possibility that if the planet has enough volatile to fight against atmospheric erosion, then even after this intense phase of runaway greenhouse combined with atmospheric erosion, there will still be some material left. And so far, this is still, and I will put it as an open question, and very important open question, it is still an open question of do rocky planets orbiting temperate orbit around M stars, so low mass stars, have an atmosphere or not? Frankly, no one really knows. We will have observation soon to tackle this question, and this is a very important question because if most planets orbiting low mass stars do not have atmosphere, then we are a bit stuck because this is the only planet, at least in the next decades, that we can probe and that we can use to test our concept of habitability. So we'll have to wait, the next generation of telescope. So it's a long time, there are a lot of things in the process. So that will delay for several decades, if it's the case, our ability to probe for the first time the atmosphere and the habitability of planets outside the solar system. And I will say a few words about it, but James Webb, the telescope James Webb, will be probably the first to tackle this question with observations. Let's move to the chapter 4, exoplanet habitability with modern 3D climate models. So this will be a very short chapter, but I have a bias because this is my field of research. But I just would like to give you, let's say, a few examples of where we are right now in terms of climate modeling of this, let's say, exotic type of planet. So as I already told you, and as I think you have well ingested right now, planets orbiting low mass stars are likely to be tidally locked, with a hot day side and a cold night side. I just would like to clarify a few things that were, let's say, demonstrated with the help of climate models that I will call misconceptions about tidally locked planets. There are three things that we hear from time to time regarding this planet. The first one is that we do expect them, because they have a permanent day side and a permanent night side, to have extreme day-to-night surface temperature gradients. That the terminator is the ideal location because it's not too hot, not too cold. And that the atmosphere is unstable because it collapses on the night side due to the very low temperature on the night side. In fact, so the difficulty to tackle this problem is that we really need to explore these processes three-dimensional model because by essence, the distribution of the insolation on this planet is 3D. And so you need 3D models to tackle this problem. And so as a community with several models, we have explored what's the climate, the potential climates of planets, that are tidally locked. And so in this case, what you see here is a result, an animation that is taken from a GCM, a global climate model simulation that we are developing in France, in Paris, Bordeaux laboratories. And that essentially shows you what will be the surface temperature and the oceanic ice coverage if you were to put the Earth suddenly in synchronous rotation, tidally locked. Okay? What you see is that, of course, there are some contrast of temperature between the day side and the night side. So this is the day side, this is the night side. You see that on the night side, you are fully covered in this simulation. Of course, it changes if you changes the insolation, the atmospheric composition. But here, you see that the night side is fully glaciated, but the day side is almost entirely deglaciated. And what you can do is that you can repeat these experiments by varying lots of parameters, and in particular, one of them that is very important is the atmospheric surface pressure. So what you see here are surface temperature maps for the exoplanet TRAPPIST-1e, so the fourth planet in the TRAPPIST-1 system. This is in the habitable zone of TRAPPIST-1 today. And so you see the surface temperature as a function of the atmospheric pressure that is simulated in the model from 1/100th of the atmospheric pressure on Earth up to 10 times the atmospheric pressure on Earth. And so there are a few things that you see. First of all, you see that even with a little bit of atmospheric pressure, you see that it's enough essentially to produce some strong heat redistribution to significantly reduce essentially the temperature contrast between the day side and the night side. And of course, if you go to the extreme case of a planet with a very strong atmospheric thickness, then you have a surface temperature that are almost isothermal. Then the second thing is that, at least in these simulations and in all the simulations we do of these planets, usually, at least if you make the assumption in this simulation that water is liquid at the beginning at the surface, then we do see that in this simulation, the preferential location, for let's say habitable conditions is not at the terminator, but is on the day side. The region that you see here is the delimitation between if you are here, you are deglaciated, and if you are here, you are fully covered by ice. And so in this case, you see you are fully deglaciated. And last but not least, in any of these simulations, we do observe atmospheric collapse. So sometimes we do observe atmospheric collapse. That is to say, sometimes the atmosphere is cold enough on the night side that it starts to condense on the surface. And so that's a process to completely get rid of the atmosphere. But this requires some specific conditions to reach the atmospheric collapse. Something that is really interesting and that might be counterintuitive is that we have now reached kind of a consensus inside the community of people studying this weird object, tidally locked planets, that in fact tidal locking may be actually an advantage to sustain liquid water at the surface of a planet. The reason I will try to explain you in the next few slides. Here you see a simulation that was performed by my colleague Jérémy Lecomte, where you see essentially with the same model the surface temperature on a tidally locked planet that is slowly rotating. This is day side, this is night side. We do make the assumption in this simulation that the surface is fully covered by liquid water. So this is what we call an aqua planet. Okay? What we do observe in these simulations, if we make this assumption, is that essentially, and this is something that is repeated with all the climate models that have performed this thought experiment, that we see some clouds that are preferentially, forming on the day side. And this, as a consequence, produces what we call an increase of the albedo. So the albedo is the reflectivity of the planet. And something that is super interesting is that if you put the planet very close from the star, you will get more and more of these clouds, and so you will increase more and more the albedo, which will stabilize the climate of the planet, and so the habitability of the planet. And so if you decrease the insolation received by the planet, you will decrease the cloud cover, and so you will stabilize, again, the climate and the habitability of the planet. I just would like to go you through this scheme because I think this is something that is very interesting, this process. Basically, it requires to have a slowly rotating planet. If you have a slowly rotating planet with some oceans at the surface, what will happen is that essentially the solar flux or the stellar flux will be concentrated on the day side of the planet. So it will warm the air on the day side, it will warm the surface and the ocean on the day side. And this strong warming that you see here will trigger some atmospheric convection because the warm air here is less dense than the cold air above, so it will trigger convection. And because the atmosphere, is hot, it's full of water vapor. And so as you trigger convection, you essentially produces ascending motions of air parcels that are full of water vapor. But as you ascend an air parcel that is full of water, you reduces its temperature. And if you reduces its temperature, at some point you will reach the point where you will start to condense the water. And so if you condense water vapor in an atmosphere, you form clouds. And so this is essentially why we do see in these simulations clouds forming at the subsolar points, essentially on the day side. Just to give you a little bit of context, this is also something that we do see on Earth. So of course, the Earth is not a slowly rotating planet. The rotation period of the Earth is roughly, it is 1 day. So this is quite fast, in fact, compared to tidally locked planets, for instance, that TRAPPIST-1 planet, if you go to the hotter ones, can have orbital period up to 20 days. So it's pretty slow rotation compared to the Earth. But you see that on the Earth, that even with 1 day, there is still a concentration of the solar flux at the equator. And this actually concentration of the solar flux at the equator produces what maybe some of you know as the Hadley cells. So this is the main atmospheric cells that transport air from the equator to the tropics. And so near the equator, essentially you have atmospheric convection, and so you have a production of clouds. And this is what we see here in these observations, where you have a preferential formation of clouds that we call ITCZ, so the Earth Intertropical Convergence Zone. And but by the way, is one of the main sources of uncertainty in our description of the way Earth will evolve in the next century. Something super interesting is that we can report these results for the tidally locked case on the diagram of the habitable zone. If we take into account with a 3D model the effect of clouds. If you do that, you will essentially, I told you, basically with having clouds you increase the albedo, so you push away this runaway green moss limit to the left. And so if you do that, you can do some GCM simulations where we do the exact same experiment that I discussed earlier with this runaway greenhouse and this sudden jump in the surface temperature, but you do it with 3D climate model. It's a bit more complex, but we can do it. And then you can derive this limit that is essentially much further away, that increases almost by a factor of 2 the size of the habitable zone. And you see that essentially there are a lot of processes that can affect this zone, and it's an ongoing effort to include as much as possible processes into the definition of the habitable zone to, let's say, better constrain the range of planets where we could find habitable planets, but also when we will find them, we will have some theory, to compare the observation that we'll have with what have been predicted with these models. And now I'm reaching my question number 3, which is, I believe, a very important question that people in the field are asking themselves at the moment. I told you at the beginning of my presentation that there is a hierarchy of climate model. We do have 1D climate model, the Parisian pigeon. So they are very flexible and they are very efficient, but they are very simple. For instance, they cannot include the effect of clouds, but that by essence are 3D. And on the other hand, we do have this climate model, this global climate model that are very sophisticated, that include the effect of clouds, dynamics, etc. But they cost a lot. Like if you want to run a simulation, for instance, like like this one, sometimes it can take 1,000 or even tens of thousands of computing hours in big clusters. So you cannot run thousands of them. So that's the problem, because if you want to have a high range of parameters, or if you want to explore how planets evolve in time, then you don't really know how to do. And so we are asking ourselves, how to include these 3D effects to simulate planets over the long term. And there are some ideas in the field to do that, but this is a current active field of research, and this will have strong consequences to tackle the habitability of planets inside and outside the solar system. Okay, so let's move to the last part of this presentation, probably the most exciting part, because this so far I've been essentially talking about model results, and now I'm going to talk about potential observations. So essentially, these slides summarize what I believe are all the most promising techniques to characterize the atmosphere and therefore the potential habitability of small terrestrial planets in the habitable zone or close to the habitable zone of their star. And I will go through some of these techniques. This is a timeline here that you see that roughly summarize which instruments or telescopes will allow us to perform these techniques. This is some instruments that are going to really, or some telescopes that are going to really change the way we explore and we understand exoplanets, and in particular, habitability of exoplanets. The first, I believe, game changer is the James Webb, the JWST. So it's already operational since 2022, and it's observing right now tens up to 50, 100 exoplanets. Some of them, in particular the TRAPPIST-1 planets, are in the target list. And so we will be, in the coming weeks, in the coming months, we'll have for the first time observations of the surface, the atmosphere, of some of the planets that have been discussing so far. The second game changer in the field will be the ELT, the European Extremely Large Telescope. This is a telescope that is currently under construction. It will be a telescope. It is a telescope that is being built in Chile. It is equipped with a mirror that is about 39 meters in diameter. So this is really extreme in size. And it will be equipped with some instrument, in particular the instrument that is called Andes. This is a second generation instrument. And then another instrument that is called PCS, and that will have, at least on the paper, the capability to probe the atmosphere of these exoplanets. The best candidate for this telescope, being Proxima b, because this is the closest exoplanet. And in the longer term future, we'll have some very interesting project, but of course this is more distant in the future. The first one is HWO, so this is Habitable World Observatory. And for those, some of you might know this project as this is the new name of the combination of LUVOIR and ABEX. So this is basically going to target habitable planets around massive planets that are more massive, more, let's say, similar to the Sun. Then we'll have the project LIFE. So at least it's in, let's say, design phase. So people are discussing, science case and how much it costs, etc., etc. So there are lots of papers about that. And the idea will be to put an interferometer in space, so an array of telescopes in space that essentially will have the ability to detect the thermal emission of a bunch of small exoplanets. And so this is kind of the landscape of all the big astronomical projects that will have the capability to probe small temperate rocky exoplanets. So let's go through some of these techniques. The first one I would like to go through is what we call transmission or transit spectroscopy. It's kind of an updated version of the transit method. The idea is that I told you earlier that a way to detect exoplanet is you look at when the planet passes in front of a star, you measure the depth of the transit, the depth of the signal, and you can access with this technique the radius and the orbital period of a planet. But there is kind of an improved version of this technique that is called transit spectroscopy, and that consists of doing the exact same thing, but at different wavelengths. So essentially, we'll measure in the visible or in the infrared or in the far infrared at several wavelengths, and you will be able to measure somehow the radius of the planet as a function of wavelength. The idea is that if you have a planet with an atmosphere in it, and this atmosphere of course has some molecules in it, then you do expect the molecule in the atmosphere to absorb differently depending on the wavelength where you are looking at. So if you are looking, for example, at this transit at, let's say, of the Earth, let's say, near in the visible, then you will, except if you put the clouds aside, then you will probe roughly the surface, okay? But if you go to 15 microns, where CO2 absorbs a lot, then you will probe something that is much deeper, much higher in the atmosphere, And so the planet will look much bigger. And so the idea is that if you are able to do that at several wavelengths, then you might be able to detect some molecular feature into the atmosphere. So people have been doing that, for a while now, but since the James Webb, the field is really being revolutionized. And so I would like to show you now the first transit spectrum. So it's not of a terrestrial, planet of the inside the habitable zone, but this is one of the very first transit spectrum that is obtained by the JWST, and it was obtained here in the context of the hot Jupiter WASP-39b, so a giant planet with a very hot atmosphere. So it is much easier to observe, but this is just to show you some context. So if you want to look at the paper, this is something that was led by the early release science team and the paper by Rustam Kulov 2023. It's already published in Nature, so if you want to look at it. And essentially, it shows you the transit depth. So the transit depth is really, this signal that you see here is the ratio between this and the total signal from the star. And so you see that if you had a planet with no atmosphere, you would expect the signal to be completely flat. Okay? Because a rocky planet with no atmosphere, should appear the same size whether you look at it in the visible or in the infrared. But because this giant planet, has an atmosphere with molecules in it, then you see some strong variation in the spectrum. So we do see some water vapor, for instance, in this spectrum. So this was already detected in over let's say, previous missions. So this is not for the first time that we look at transit spectra, but this is for the first time that we look at it with such a precision. So in this spectrum, we detect some sodium that you see here, this peak here. So this was already detected before. And we did, they did two first detection of CO2. So the big peak that you see here at 4.3 micron is CO2. and potentially even this small signature that you see here, SO2. And he did it with a crazy precision. So just to give you an idea, I put here the level of detection for the different molecules. So for instance, water vapor was detected at 33 sigma. So just to give you a typical, let's say, comparison, we usually assume in the exoplanet community that a strong signal is detected when we reach 5 sigma precision. So 30 sigma is just insane. CO2 28 sigma, it's the first detection, and we detect it at 28 sigma. So this is again insane. And SO2 is a bit more, let's say, not less convincing, but we do expect to have more observations soon of this same planet that are likely to confirm this signal. So really, this is one of the first spectrum, but this is just to show you that the James Webb is really working well, and actually it's working even better than what we expected. So the instruments are working better than what we did expect, and the lifetime of the telescope is likely to be longer than expected as well. So lots of good news with the James Webb. So in the context of this presentation, of course, we are interested in small planets in the habitable zone of low mass stars. So the best system that we do have so far is the TRAPPIST-1 system. And we do already have some observations ongoing. Some of them are already being obtained. Some people are analyzing it. Some people are in the process of publishing things. So I won't be able to show you anything today, unfortunately, because there is some embargo on this detection. But I will show you a typical example of what we could expect to see with this observation. So we will have to wait a few more months to see the results of the first observation of JWST in the context of small planets in the habitable zone of their star. What you see here is the exact same plot than before. It shows you essentially the transit depth as a function of wavelength. The first thing that you can see here is that the variation in the spectrum, so they are visible here, but they are much weaker than in the hot Jupiter case. They are typically a factor 50. So the amplitude of the feature that you see here is 50 times smaller than what I've just showed before in the case of the spectrum of the hot Jupiter, where you had typically variation on the order of 0.1%, something typically like that. And here we are more on the order of 0.04%. So this is really small, but we can compute, a realistic observation. We can compute error bars, and in this case, we're able to show that if the planet has a fixed CO2 atmosphere, we should be able, in principle, in typically 4 transits, to detect the existence of CO2. So just to give you some context, for the first cycle of JWST, we have 2 transits of the planet TRAPPIST-1G. So if we detect something, it will be at, let's say, low signal to noise, but this could be confirmed with a second step, a second phase of observation of this planet. For this case, you see that essentially the features that you see here are the features that are produced by CO2. So we see again the 4.3 micron CO2 feature that is the most prominent in all the spectrum, in all the spectra that we did for the small planets, at least for planets orbiting low mass stars. The second technique that will be extremely promising is detecting thermal emission from the planet. There are 2 ways to detect it, either by looking at thermal phase curves or either by looking at secondary eclipses. The idea is that you have a star, okay, you have a planet around it, and this planet, so this is particularly easy to show you in the case where this planet is tidally locked, but essentially this planet is expected to, on the day side to be quite hot, and on the day side to be cooler because of the distribution of the insolation. And so you expect, if you measure the system of the star and the planet as it evolves through time, to detect variation of the signals that is emitted by the planet in emission over the course of the planet around the stars. And there is one specific context, which is if by chance the planet is passing exactly in front of the star, so it should also pass behind the star. This is what we call the secondary eclipse. And in this case, if the planet passes behind, then you might see, another depth another drop of flux that we call secondary eclipse. That is a way to probe the thermal emission of a planet. And I would like to show you, so this is not result from the James Webb, but this is result from the Spitzer telescope that were done a few years ago by the group led by Laura Kreitberg. And this is, as far as I know, the planet with the lowest size for which we were able to use this technique. So here we are looking at LHS 3844b, which is a planet that is roughly the size of the Earth, okay, but that is a bit warmer than the Earth. Here it receives 70 times the insolation on Earth. So it's not really an Earth analog, but still, it's a small planet. Okay, it's hot, but it's a small planet. And you see that they were able to detect, as the planet, evolve over the course, over the orbit around the star, they were able to detect first a fluctuation of the thermal emission of the planet, okay? And at the location of the secondary eclipse, they were able to detect, decrease, a drop of the emission of the planet. And they were able to use these measurements to say, okay, this planet, because the shape of the thermal phase curve and the amplitude of the secondary eclipse is so, this planet is unlikely to have an atmosphere. And so that was the main conclusion of this paper that was published in Nature. Of course, this is not completely unexpected because this planet received 70 times the insolation on Earth, but it is the first time, at least, that we were able to use this technique on a planet that is the size of the Earth. With James Webb, we are going to do that for the first time. So it's not planned for the first cycle, but this is likely to be for the next cycle. We'll likely be able to do it for more temperate planets. And just to show you a proof of concept, I would like to show you some results that were obtained in the context of Proxima Centauri b, so the closest exoplanet from us. So this planet, unfortunately, does not transit the star, which means we cannot use the transit spectroscopy technique, which means we cannot detect secondary eclipse, but we can see in principle the phase curve, so the way the thermal emission evolve over the evolution of the planet around the star. Because this is well illustrated in this plot. The planet doesn't have to transit or doesn't have to pass behind the star to show some fluctuation of the thermal emission. And so just to show you a little bit of context, this is a plot that shows you the planet to star contrast as a function of the evolution of the planet around the star. This is the case here for Proxima b, and we are in the infrared. And here, this is a planet with no atmosphere. So very strong contrast of temperature on the day to the night side, and so very strong contrast of emission from the day to the night. If you add an atmosphere on it, okay, you increase the heat redistribution on the planet, so you decrease the temperature contrast. So you decrease, let's say, the amplitude of the planet to star contrast. If you add, if you change the rotation, or if you add an ocean, or if you put a very thick atmosphere, that will change a lot the way the atmosphere or the ocean redistribute heat across the atmosphere of the planet, across the surface of the planet. And this will have strong implication on the shape of this phase curve. And this is something, so this, for this planet, it will be very challenging because it is right at the limit of the, let's say, expected performance of JWST, but this is likely to be tested in the next cycles. But we will have, for the first time, the capability, to probe the existence of an atmosphere around the closest exoplanet from us, which is also very, let's say, fortunately, a planet that is similar, at least in mass and insolation, to the Earth. The third technique I would like to discuss is the technique of direct imaging, but using the reflected light. So the direct imaging, this has been mentioned this morning as well, consists essentially at looking directly at the light that is coming from the planet. So far, with the observation that I've discussed, the transit spectroscopy method or the phase curve or secondary eclipse method, there are techniques where essentially you look at both the signal from the planet and the star and you try to disentangle the two of them using, you saw some retrieval techniques. Here what we are doing is that you have a planet, you have a star, so this is a star, you have a planet that is here, and the idea is to hide with a mask or a coronagraph a significant fraction of the light coming from the star. And by doing that, you decrease the contrast between the light from the star and that of the planet, and you let the signal from the planet appear. So far, this technique has been only used in the context of very massive and very young planets, which have the advantages of being at the same time far away from the star, which is easily to spatially, resolve them, and as well because they are young, they are hot, and so they have a strong emission that is more easy to detect. In the context of temperate exoplanet around, stars, temperate rocky exoplanet around stars, we cannot use this technique because the planet is too close from the star and it's not bright enough, to be seen. But we believe we could be able to probe the light that is reflected by the planet. And the idea is that we have some observational plans using the extremely large telescope, the ELT. So this is an artist's view of the structure of the ELT under construction in Chile. And we'll be able to, using at the same time this direct imaging technique, and at the same time using very high resolution spectroscopy, we'll be able, by combining the two techniques, to detect, or in principle, in a few nights, some molecules in the atmosphere of the most nearby exoplanets, if they have an atmosphere, of course. What you see here is a synthetic spectrum of the light that is reflected by Proxima b if we assume an atmosphere similar to that of the Earth. This is some simulation that were performed for the instrument Andes that will be on the ELT, for the second generation instrument. And so what you see here is the contrast ratio between the planet and the star. Basically, if this contrast is high, then it's easier to detect something, and if it's low, it's more difficult. Something is that, so here, the feature that you see here, they are produced by the existence of molecules in the atmosphere of this planet. Essentially, we are probing photons that are emitted by the star, here Proxima Centauri, that goes into the planet and that are reflected back on Earth. And so essentially we are probing photons that were able to cross the atmosphere, either reflect on the clouds or on the surface, and then that were able to go back from us. And it means like wherever you have, let's say, molecules in the atmosphere that absorb at specific wavelength, then you should have no photons. And this is what you see, for instance, here in the context of oxygen. If I zoom a little bit, in a region where we have a strong absorption lines from oxygen, from O2, then you see lots of features here that are absorption features. And essentially, that means like if you look exactly here, we are exactly at the absorption lines of oxygen, then you do expect that there won't be any photons coming back to Earth, or very small fraction. And so with these techniques, combining direct imaging with high resolution spectroscopy, by combining the signals, in each of these lines, we'll be able to stack some signals. And in principle, this is still calculation ongoing in this working group, but we'll be able, in a few nights of observation on the ELT, to characterize for the first time molecular detections of molecules like water vapor or oxygen in the most nearby exoplanet, Proxima b being the best planet we have at hand. That leads to last and fourth open question of this presentation, of this course, which is, we are really wondering at the moment, what are reliable biomarkers. So I discussed oxygen. Here, of course, on Earth, this is a good biomarker, but around planets, especially planets around low-mass stars, we know now lots of processes that could produce oxygen and that do not involve life. So there is a big question, key questions about really what are reliable biomarkers or pairs of molecules of biomarkers, And the other questions that is also, let's say, super important and that not so many people have explored, which is what are the markers of habitability? Once we'll have this spectra, what the spectra can tell us and give us some information. Okay, is this planet habitable? And by is this planet habitable, I mean, is this planet that I'm looking at covered by liquid water, surfaces, liquid water oceans or not? And it's a difficult question because detecting water vapor is not actually a good marker of habitability. And with that, just reaching my summary slides, just a few minutes to summarize that. So essentially, we've seen that rocky exoplanets in the habitable zone of their stars are abundant. And it's not only theory, because we know have many of them, like if in the solar neighborhood, we have lots of targets. I discussed about Proxima b, TRAPPIST-1, because these are the best targets we have for follow-up observations, but we have plenty of them, typically 40, 50 candidates at the moment. And we do expect this number to grow up in the coming years. The habitable zone, despite a bad naming, I think we should reward it, but I don't have the power to do so, is a useful concept to search for habitable exoplanets, to guide astronomical observation, even sometimes, help to design some instruments, some telescopes, and is a powerful, let's say, concept to test our understanding of planetary habitability once we'll have some true observations to compare. If we detect some exoplanets that are outside of the habitable zone and that prove to be habitable, well, that will put a lot of questions the same way that early Mars put a lot of questions. The third point is that the habitable zone is not something that is so simple. It's continuously evolving, and more people, are working on it to include more and more processes. 3D effect, like the effect of clouds, the dynamics. Temporal evolution, to see how, the past evolution evolved the habitability and the habitable zone today. That includes also geochemical cycle, that can change depending on the type of rocks that you have on the planet. So there are lots of papers and lots of ideas going around, and this affects, of course, the extension of the habitable zone. But that doesn't, let's say, prevent the habitable zone from being a useful concept. And last but not least, observation with the GWST. The first results are going to be published in the coming weeks, in the coming months. And later on with the ELT, in particular the European ELT, have the power to probe for the first time secondary atmosphere around rocky exoplanets in the habitable zone of their stars. And I believe this is going to be really a revolution for the field of exoplanets, because for the first time we are going to have true observations for which we can really, test our concept of habitability, or concept of, planetary atmosphere around small planets. And this is super powerful, not only to do comparative habitability, but more generally to do comparative planetology. So far in the solar system, we have been doing it essentially with Earth, Mars, and Venus. And we now have a sample of exoplanets that will be able to probe, and that will increase this number by at least one order of magnitude in the coming years. So this is really, I believe, exciting and fascinating. And with that, I would like to thank you, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate.